The crisp September air carried promises of new beginnings as I stepped through the wrought iron gates of Westfield Academy. The prestigious school stood tall and imposing against the clear blue sky, its brick facade dating back over 100 years. I clutched my backpack straps so tightly my knuckles turned white beneath my brown skin. The weight of my mother's sacrifices and my own dreams pressed down on my 14-year-old shoulders. But I stood tall, my chin held high, despite the flutter of anxiety in my chest. "Don't forget who you are," Mom had whispered that morning, adjusting the collar of my uniform blazer. "You belong anywhere your mind can take you." Those words echoed in my head as I navigated the crowded hallway, scanning the room numbers until I found my first class, Advanced Literature with Ms. Harrington. According to the school's website, Elizabeth Harrington had been teaching at Westfield for 23 years and had received numerous teaching accolades. Her classroom was my first stop in this new world, and I could barely contain my excitement. I arrived 15 minutes early, finding only Ms. Harrington arranging papers at her desk. She looked up as I entered, a woman in her early 50s, with graying blonde hair pulled into a tight bun and thin-rimmed glasses perched on her nose. "Good morning," I said, smiling. "I'm Maya Johnson. I'm new here." Her eyes moved over me slowly, from my carefully braided hair to my polished shoes. Something in her expression shifted, almost imperceptibly. "Yes," she said, her voice cool and distant. "I see you're on my roster." She turned back to her papers without another word. I stood there for a moment, unsure if I should say something else, but eventually made my way to an empty desk in the second row. As other students filed in, they greeted Ms. Harrington warmly, and she responded with a smile that hadn't appeared. For me. I told myself I was imagining things, that first-day nerves were making me hypersensitive. When the bell rang, Ms. Harrington addressed the class with practiced ease. "Welcome to Advanced Literature. For those who don't know me, I'm Ms. Harrington, and I've been guiding Westfield students through the classics for over 2 decades. She paused, scanning the room. "I expect excellence from every student in this classroom. Westfield has a reputation to uphold, and I take that responsibility seriously." Her gaze lingered on me for a beat longer than the others, and something in her eyes made my stomach tighten. "Today we'll begin with introductions," she continued. "I'd like each of you to stand and share your name, where you attended school previously, and what you hope to accomplish this year." One by one, students stood and introduced themselves. Most had attended Westfield's middle school or other private institutions in the area. When my turn came, I stood, squaring my shoulders, the way my mother had taught me. "I'm Maya Johnson. I previously attended Roosevelt Public School, and this year I hope to expand my understanding of literature and perhaps work on the school newspaper." Before I could sit down, Ms. Harrington interjected. "Roosevelt Public? That's in the East District, isn't it?" Her tone made it sound like she was referring to another country entirely. "Yes, ma'am," I replied evenly. "And how did you come to join us at Westfield?" The room fell silent. No one else had been asked this question. "I received an academic scholarship," I explained, feeling the eyes of every student on me. "I scored in the 98th percentile on the entrance exam." She nodded slowly. "Well, Westfield is quite different from Roosevelt. I hope you'll be able to adjust to our standards." Heat rose to my cheeks, but I kept my expression neutral as I sat down. Someone behind me whispered something I couldn't quite catch, followed by muffled laughter. The remainder of the class passed in a blur of syllabi reviews and reading assignments. When the bell rang, I gathered my materials slowly, waiting until most of the students had left before approaching Miss Harrington's desk with a question about the reading list. "Miss Harrington, I've already read several of these books at my previous school. Would it be possible to substitute some—" "Maya," she interrupted, not looking up from her planner. "Westfield's curriculum has been carefully designed. The fact that you may have read simplified versions of these works doesn't mean you've studied them to our standards." "They weren't simplified versions," I countered gently. "We covered the original texts in my honors program." She glanced up, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Listen, I understand this must all be very new to you. Westfield students have a certain profile. They come from backgrounds that have prepared them for the rigors of our academic environment. It might take time for you to find your footing here, if you do." Her words hung in the air between us, sharp and pointed. "I'm prepared for the work," I assured her, gripping my books tighter. "We'll see," she replied. "Though I wonder if perhaps you might be more comfortable at a school that's more suitable for your circumstances." I stood, frozen, the implication of her words settling over me like a cold shadow. This wasn't about my academic preparation. This was about something else entirely. "I earned my place here," I said quietly, summoning every ounce of dignity my 14 years had accumulated. "Scholarships are a noble institution," she responded, with a dismissive wave of her hand. "But they don't always consider the full picture. Academic fit is about more than test scores." I walked out of her classroom with my head high and my heart pounding. In the bathroom, I splashed cold water on my face and stared at my reflection in the mirror. My mother's words came back to me. "You belong anywhere your mind can take you." I took a deep breath, straightened my blazer, and headed to my next class. The days that followed established a pattern. In Miss Harrington's class, my raised hand was consistently overlooked. My written assignments received harsher scrutiny than others, with red marks highlighting minor errors, while similar mistakes in other students' papers went uncorrected. When reading assignments were given out, I was repeatedly assigned parts, with the fewest lines or most stereotypical characters. One morning, 2 weeks into the semester, I arrived early to find a group of students gathered around Emily Parker, the class president, who was distributing invitations to her birthday party. "It's at my parents' lake house," she was saying excitedly. "Everyone's staying overnight. My mom hired a DJ and everything." When she reached my desk, she hesitated, then continued to the student behind me. I kept my eyes on my book, pretending I hadn't noticed. But Miss Harrington had seen the exchange as she entered the classroom. "Emily, dear, make sure you've given one to everyone," she said loudly. Emily shifted uncomfortably. I wasn't sure if Maya would want to come. It's pretty far from where she lives. Miss Harrington glanced at me with what might have appeared to others as concern. "Well, we wouldn't want to put Maya in an uncomfortable situation. These social gatherings have their own culture. I'm sure she has her own activities that would be more familiar." The class fell silent, and I felt my face burning with humiliation. I wanted to speak up, to challenge the assumptions being made, but the words stuck in my throat. After class, I lingered again, determined to address the situation directly. "Miss Harrington, may I speak with you for a moment?" she sighed, checking her watch. "I have a faculty meeting, Maya. Can this wait?" "I don't think so," I said, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. "I've noticed that you treat me differently than the other students, and I'd like to understand why." She removed her glasses, folding them carefully. "Maya, I've been teaching at Westfield for 23 years. In that time, I've developed an understanding of which students are likely to thrive in our environment. I'm simply being realistic about your prospects here." "Based on what?" I asked. "My grades are excellent. I participate in class. Or try to. I've completed all assignments on time. There's more to belonging at Westfield than academics," she replied. "There's a cultural fit that's equally important. Students here share certain background experiences, values, expectations. It's not that one is better than another. They're just different." "You mean because I'm from the East District? Or because I'm here on scholarship?" I pressed. She hesitated, giving me a long look. "Maya, I'm simply suggesting that you might be happier somewhere where the demographics more closely align with your own experiences. Perhaps you should consider whether Westfield is truly the right place for you." The truth of what she was saying and what she wasn't saying hung heavy in the air between us. This wasn't about my address or my scholarship. This was about the brown skin I lived in. "I belong here," I said quietly. "I earned my place." "That remains to be seen," she replied, gathering her things. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have that meeting." I walked home that day instead of taking the bus, needing the time to think. The maple trees lining the streets were just beginning to turn, hints of gold and crimson appearing among the green. By the time I reached our modest 2-bedroom apartment, I had made a decision. I wouldn't tell my mother about Ms. Harrington. Not yet. Mom had worked too hard to get me into Westfield, picking up extra shifts as a law clerk while attending night classes to finish her degree. The last thing she needed was another battle to fight. That evening, as we sat at our small kitchen table eating dinner, Mom asked about school. "How are your classes going, baby? Making any friends?" I focused on my plate. "Classes are challenging but good. Everyone's still getting to know each other." She reached across the table, covering my hand with hers. "Maya, look at me." I raised my eyes to meet hers. "What's really going on? This is the 3rd night you've barely touched your food, and I heard you crying last night." I hesitated, not wanting to burden her, but my mother had always been able to read me like one of her law books. "There's a teacher," I began slowly. "Ms. Harrington, she doesn't think I belong at Westfield." Mom's expression remained calm, but I saw the flash of something in her eyes, a fierce protectiveness that both comforted and concerned me. "Has she said this directly?" I nodded, recounting some of our interactions. With each example, my mother's jaw tightened, but she listened without interrupting. "She keeps suggesting I find a more suitable school," I finished. "Today she said something about demographics and cultural fit." Mom was quiet for a long moment. "Maya, you know what she's really talking about, don't you?" "Yes," I whispered. She squeezed my hand. "You earned your place at that school. Your test scores were exceptional. Your grades are outstanding. You belong there as much as anyone else." "But what if she's right?" The fear that had been growing inside me finally spilled out. What if I don't fit in? What if I never will? "Listen to me," Mom said firmly. "There are going to be people in this world who look at you and see only the color of your skin. They'll try to put limitations on you based on nothing but their own prejudice. Your job isn't to make them comfortable. Your job is to be so excellent they can't ignore you." She stood up, walking to her briefcase and pulling out a folder. "I wasn't going to tell you this yet, but I think you need to hear it now. I passed the bar exam last month." My eyes widened. "Mom, that's amazing. Why didn't you tell me?" A smile spread across her face. I wanted to surprise you once everything was finalized. I've been offered a position with Marshall & Williams starting next month. I gasped. Marshall & Williams was one of the most prestigious law firms in the city, known for their civil rights work. This doesn't just change things for us financially, she continued. It means I have resources now. Colleagues, connections. You're not alone in this fight, Maya, and neither am I. The next morning, I walked into Miss Harrington's class with renewed determination. When she passed back our essays on the Great Gatsby, I found a C marked on mine. Despite having spent hours crafting what I thought was a thoughtful analysis, I raised my hand. Ms. Harrington, could you explain why I received this grade? I'd like to understand where I fell short. She seemed surprised by my directness. Your analysis lacked depth, Maya. You missed the nuances of the class commentary Fitzgerald was making. I discussed the divide between old and new money extensively in paragraphs 3 through 5, I pointed out. And I analyzed how Gatsby's attempt to cross that divide ultimately led to his downfall. Her lips thinned. It wasn't sophisticated enough for Westfield standards. After class, I approached her desk again. Ms. Harrington, I've reviewed the rubric carefully, and I believe my essay met all the criteria for at least a B. Would you be willing to reconsider my grade? Maya, she said with an exaggerated sigh. This constant questioning of my evaluation suggests you may not be ready for the level of criticism that comes with a rigorous academic environment like ours. I met her gaze steadily. I'm not questioning criticism. I'm seeking clarification so I can improve. Isn't that the purpose of education? Something flashed in her eyes. Annoyance, perhaps, or surprise at my persistence. The purpose of Westfield's education is excellence, she replied coldly. Not everyone is equipped to meet our standards. Now I suggest you focus on your next assignment rather than dwelling on this one. As I turned to leave, she added, Maya, I've been meaning to speak with you about your place here. Perhaps we should schedule a meeting with your mother to discuss whether Westfield is truly the right fit for you. I froze, then turned back slowly. My mother would be happy to meet with you. She just passed the bar exam and will be joining Marshall & Williams next month. She's very interested in educational equity. The change in Miss Harrington's expression was subtle but unmistakable. A slight widening of the eyes, a momentary parting of the lips. Marshall & Williams? The law firm? I nodded. Yes, she's particularly interested in their civil rights division. I see, Miss Harrington said, shuffling papers on her desk. Well, perhaps we can revisit this conversation another time. That evening I told my mother about the exchange, including my mention of her new job. She listened thoughtfully, then reached for her phone. I think it's time I introduced myself to Miss Harrington, she said. The next morning I arrived at school to find an unusual scene. Miss Harrington standing outside her classroom door, greeting each student personally. When she saw me, her smile seemed strained. Good morning, Maya, she said with a warmth I'd never heard from her before. I hope you're well today. Confused by this change, I simply nodded and took my seat. Throughout the class, Miss Harrington called on me multiple times, praising my contributions in a way that made several students turn to look at me in surprise. After class, she asked me to stay behind. Once the room had emptied, she closed the door and turned to me with what appeared to be an attempt at a genuine smile. Maya, I've been reviewing your essay again, and I believe I was hasty in my evaluation. You made several insightful points that I overlooked initially. I'm adjusting your grade to a B+. She handed me my paper, now marked with a different grade. "Thank you," I said cautiously. "I also wanted to apologize if I've made you feel unwelcome in any way," she continued, not quite meeting my eyes. "That was never my intention. We value diversity at Westfield." The abrupt change was jarring. I knew something had happened, but I wasn't sure what. "May I ask what prompted this reconsideration?" I ventured. Miss Harrington's smile tightened. "I simply realized I hadn't given your work the attention it deserved. Later that day, as I was leaving school, I saw my mother's car in the parking lot. She rolled down the window as I approached. 'How was school today?' she asked, with a knowing look in her eyes. 'Strangely different,' I replied, climbing into the passenger seat. 'Miss Harrington was almost nice to me. She even changed my essay. Grade, what did you do?' Mom pulled out of the parking lot before answering. I called the school this morning and asked to speak with Miss Harrington. When she got on the phone, I introduced myself as Vanessa Johnson, Juris Doctor, new associate at Marshall & Williams, specializing in civil rights and educational discrimination. Cases? I could imagine Miss Harrington's face during that call. I expressed concern about what you'd told me regarding her comments about your fit at the school, and her suggestion that you find somewhere more suitable. I mentioned that Marshall and Williams has a particular interest in cases involving implicit bias in educational settings. Mom glanced at me. I may have also mentioned that Judge Williams, the founding partner of the firm, is a Westfield alumnus who sits on the board of several educational foundations. "Mom!" I exclaimed, torn between horror and admiration. I finished by saying that I was looking forward to meeting her at parent-teacher conferences to discuss your progress and Westfield's commitment to creating an inclusive environment for all qualified students. She reached over to squeeze my hand. "I didn't threaten litigation, if that's what you're worried about. I simply made it clear that I'm aware of what's happening and that I have the resources to address it if necessary." I sat back, processing this information. "So now she's only being nice because she's afraid of you." Mom's expression softened. "Maya, in an ideal world, people would treat you fairly simply because it's right. But sometimes they need to understand there are consequences for their actions. Miss Harrington might be acting out of self-preservation right now, but that gives you space to prove yourself on your own merits." The change in Miss Harrington's behavior continued in the following weeks. She began acknowledging my raised hand, providing constructive feedback on my assignments, and even recommended me for the school literary magazine when I submitted a poem. It was all very correct and professional, though lacking the warmth she showed to other students. As the semester progressed, I gradually began to find my place at Westfield. I joined the debate team where my arguments earned the respect of both teammates and coaches. I made friends with a group of students in my physics class who cared more about science than social hierarchies, and my grades remained excellent across all subjects, including Miss Harrington's class. But beneath the surface, something still didn't feel right. The knowledge that Miss Harrington had only changed her behavior because she feared repercussions left a hollow feeling in my chest. She hadn't learned anything. She'd simply adjusted her tactics. The situation came to a head. In November, during our study of To Kill a Mockingbird, Miss Harrington had assigned different chapters for students to lead discussion on, and my section included Tom Robinson's trial. Maya will be guiding our analysis of chapters 17 through 21, Miss Harrington announced. For once, there was no undertone in her voice, no subtle dismissal. I had prepared extensively, researching historical context and developing discussion questions that went beyond the obvious racial themes to explore class dynamics, gender roles, and the nature of justice. As I stood at the front of the class, I saw something shift in the way my classmates looked at me. For the first time, they were seeing me as someone with valuable insights, not just as the scholarship student from the East District. After my presentation, the discussion was vibrant and thoughtful. Even Ms. Harrington seemed genuinely engaged, adding context about Southern literary traditions without overshadowing my leadership. When the bell rang, several students lingered to continue our conversation, and I felt a surge of pride. This was why I had worked so hard to come to Westfield. For this level of intellectual engagement, for these opportunities to grow. Ms. Harrington approached as the last students were leaving. That was exceptionally well done, Maya. Your analysis of how economic factors influenced the trial outcome was particularly insightful. Thank you, I replied, gathering my notes. She hesitated, then added, You have a natural talent for literary analysis. Have you considered applying for the Wellington Summer Scholars Program? The deadline is next month, and I'd be willing to write a recommendation. The Wellington program was highly prestigious, a 6-week intensive literature course at Oxford University offered to only 20 high school students nationwide each year. I wasn't aware of it, I admitted, surprised by the offer. Well, think about it, she said. You'd be facing stiff competition, of course, but you might have a chance. The qualifier, you might have a chance, revealed that the old Miss Harrington wasn't entirely gone. But it was still a significant shift from telling me I didn't belong at Westfield to suggesting I apply for an elite international program. That evening I researched the Wellington program, excitement growing as I read about the curriculum and opportunities it offered. When Mom came home, I told her about Ms. Harrington's recommendation. I'm not surprised, she said, hanging up her coat. You've always been exceptional, Maya. It just took her longer to see it than it should have. Do you think I should apply? I asked. She sat beside me looking at the program details on my laptop. Absolutely. But I want you to do it for yourself. Not to prove anything to Ms. Harrington or anyone else. I want to do it for me, I assured her. But I hesitated, then continued. I keep thinking about how none of this would be happening if you hadn't become a lawyer at a prestigious firm. She only changed because she was afraid of the consequences. Mom was quiet for a moment. That's true. And it's an ugly truth about how the world sometimes works. But here's what I want you to remember. You were qualified and deserving before I passed the bar. Your worth wasn't determined by my job title, or our address, or anything else. You forced her to see your value by continuing to excel, despite her attempts to discourage you. She brushed a strand of hair from my face. The question is, what will you do with these opportunities now that they're opening up to you? The application for the Wellington program became my focus in the weeks that followed. I worked on my essays during lunch periods and after school, refining them with help from both my mother and, surprisingly, Ms. Harrington, who offered feedback during her free periods. One afternoon in December, as I was making final revisions in the library, Emily Parker, whose birthday party I hadn't been invited to months earlier, sat down across from me. Is that the Wellington application? She asked, nodding toward my laptop. Yes, I replied cautiously. Emily and I hadn't spoken much since the beginning of the year. I'm applying too, she said. My father attended Oxford, so I've been planning on it since forever. She paused, studying me. Ms. Harrington's writing your recommendation, right? Everyone's talking about how you're her new favorite. The comment carried a hint of resentment. I wouldn't say that. I responded carefully. We've just found some common ground through literature. Emily fidgeted with her bracelet. You know, I was never trying to be mean at the beginning of the year. It's just, Westfield has always been a certain way, with certain people. And then you came, and you were so different, but also so smart, and it was... She trailed off. Uncomfortable? I suggested. She nodded. I guess I'm still figuring some things out. It wasn't an apology, exactly. But it felt like the start of a different kind of conversation. Me too, I said. We all are. After submitting my Wellington application in January, the semester continued with a new dynamic. Ms. Harrington's treatment of me remained professional, occasionally even warm, though I noticed it was most pronounced when other faculty members or students were present. In private, there was still a certain reserve, a careful distance she maintained. In March, as we were studying Shakespearean, sonnets, I arrived at class to find Miss Harrington looking distressed, her normally perfect appearance slightly disheveled. We'll be working independently today, she announced, her voice tight. Please read sonnets 100 through 126 and complete the analysis questions on page 87. Throughout the period, she remained at her desk, occasionally checking her phone with obvious anxiety. When the bell rang, I approached her cautiously. Miss Harrington, is everything all right? She looked up, seeming surprised by my concern. It's nothing related to class, Maya. A personal matter. I nodded and turned to leave, but she called after me. Maya, wait. She hesitated, then continued. Since you asked, my mother has been hospitalized. She fell last night, and they're running tests to determine if she had a stroke. I'm so sorry, I said sincerely. Is there anything I can do? A flicker of genuine emotion crossed her face. No, but thank you for asking. I'm trying to arrange, care for her, but it's complicated. She lives alone, and I'm her only child. I thought of my own mother, how fiercely I would fight for her if she were ill. I hope she recovers quickly, I offered. Miss Harrington nodded, the mask of professional distance slipping back into place. Yes, well, these things happen as parents age. I'll see you tomorrow, Maya. The next day, Miss Harrington was absent, with a substitute teacher leading our class. For the remainder of the week, she appeared intermittently, clearly stressed and struggling to focus. I heard from other students that her mother's condition had worsened, requiring extended hospitalization. In April, when the Wellington Summer Scholars Program selections were announced, I received an email that left me staring at my screen in disbelief. I had been accepted. Out of thousands of applicants nationwide, I was one of just 20 students chosen for the Oxford program. My mother cried when I told her, holding me tight and whispering, I am so proud of you, so proud. Miss Harrington was back in school. By then, though, she still seemed preoccupied. When I showed her the acceptance email, genuine pleasure brightened her tired face. Congratulations, Maya. This is well-deserved. Thank you for your recommendation, I said. I know it made a difference. She shook her head slightly. Your application stood on its own merits. I simply provided context for your abilities. There was something different in the way she looked at me now. Not merely the careful correctness of recent months, but something that almost resembled respect. As the school year neared its end, I learned through the faculty grapevine that Ms. Harrington had requested a leave of absence for the following semester to care for her mother, who had been diagnosed with vascular dementia following her stroke. The news filled me with unexpected sympathy. For all her faults, I couldn't imagine the struggle of watching a parent's health deteriorate while trying to maintain a career. On the last day of classes, Miss Harrington asked me to stay behind. Once we were alone, she handed me a small, wrapped package. "This is for you," she said. "A token for your journey to Oxford." Inside was a beautiful leather-bound journal with my initials embossed on the cover. "For your thoughts and observations," she explained, "the summer program will transform how you see literature, and perhaps yourself." I ran my fingers over the soft leather. "Thank you. This is very thoughtful." She seemed to be struggling with something, her hands clasped tightly on her desk. "Maya, I owe you an apology. When you first arrived at Westfield, I made assumptions about you that were unfair and prejudiced." She met my eyes directly for perhaps the first time. "Your mother's intervention was necessary because I failed to see past my own biases. I'm sorry for that." The apology caught me off guard. "Thank you for saying that," I responded carefully. "I've been teaching for nearly 25 years, she continued. "In that time, I've developed certain expectations about which students will excel here. You challenged those expectations, and instead of re-examining my thinking, I tried to make you feel unwelcome." She paused. "It's not an excuse, but I want you to know that I recognize my failing." I considered her words, wondering what had prompted this confession. Was it genuine growth, or was she simply covering her bases before taking leave? "What made you change your mind?" I asked. "About me, I mean." She seemed to consider her answer carefully. "It began with your mother's call, yes, but it continued because of your persistence. You refused to be diminished by my behavior. You continued to produce exceptional work and contribute meaningfully to discussions. In time, I couldn't maintain my narrative about you in the face of such consistent evidence to the contrary." She glanced at a photo on her desk, an older woman I assumed was her mother. "Recent events in my personal life have also prompted some reflection. When you're suddenly responsible for someone who was once responsible for you, it changes your perspective." I nodded, thinking of my own mother's sacrifices. "It does. I want you to know," Miss Harrington added, "that my recommendation for Wellington was entirely based on your merit. You earned that spot, completely and absolutely." "I believe you," I said, and was surprised to realize I meant it. As I left her classroom that day, carrying the journal she'd given me, I felt something shift inside me. A knot of anger and hurt I'd been carrying for months, beginning to loosen. Miss Harrington's prejudice had wounded me deeply, but her acknowledgement of it, however delayed, offered a kind of closure I hadn't known I needed. That summer, as I walked the ancient cobblestone streets of Oxford and studied literature in buildings that had stood for centuries, I often wrote in the journal Miss Harrington had given me. I documented not just my academic insights, but my personal ones as well. Reflections on belonging, identity, and the complex nature of growth and change, both in literature and in life. When I returned to Westfield for my sophomore year, Miss Harrington was still on leave. I heard through other teachers that her mother's condition had deteriorated faster than expected, requiring full-time care that Miss Harrington was struggling to arrange with her teaching salary. It was in October, almost a year after our confrontation about my essay grade, that I saw her again. I was volunteering at a community legal clinic where my